So equality through the law. So every civil rights movement has derived moral strength from the nation's pledge of equality for all, leading to policies that have made Americans more equal in law. So remember, when we were first talking about U.S. government, we talked about those qualities that were really celebrated, really important to our government: the quality of liberty and the quality of equality, right? Sorry, the equality of being equal, right? So civil rights is a way that our nation has really tried to struggle towards achieving this ideal of being equal. And it's been a very long process to include different portions of the population. So equal rights, civil rights is the right of every person to equal protection under the laws and equal access to society's opportunities and public facilities. And this has what groups like African Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, our LGBTQIA plus community, women, we have all struggled towards these equal civil rights. And it has taken a number of years for us to even try to come close to this notion of equality. So civil liberties are specific individual rights, and equal rights or civil rights is the equal treatment of members of different groups. So basically what this is saying is civil liberties is referring to individuals, and then that civil rights, the equal rights, is referring to groups as a whole. So the equal protection clause forbids states from denying equal protection to its citizens. So we saw this in the ruling of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. This banned forced segregation in schools through the ruling that having separate facilities for different populations is inherently unequal. So under the 14th Amendment, they were able to stretch that to be able to include everyone having access to equal rights, which is why Brown v. Board of Education was able to go through. However, we saw a little change to segregation 15 years later, even whenever this law was first passed. It took, even into states like Arkansas, it took the military going into Arkansas and forcing them to desegregate their schools for our federal government to really even be able to start to work towards the desegregation of the nation. And we still see it in more subtle ways today, which we will talk about. So the Supreme Court encouraged busing as a solution to segregation because our neighborhoods, it's not as much, we still do see it, but it's not as much today. Our neighborhoods used to be very racially separated. In other words, you used to have white population living in one area, and you'd have the African American population living in another area, the Hispanic American population living in another area. So everybody was segregated down to even where they lived. So the Supreme Court encouraged busing as a solution. In other words, busing some of the children from these neighborhoods, such as the African American neighborhood, the Hispanic American neighborhood, busing them over to the schools, which would normally only serve the white population, okay, because of where they were zoned. So they had an end to racial busing in 2007. And we also saw something known as white flight to the suburbs, which is basically whenever the white population started moving away from the cities and into the suburbs. So we have still seen our neighborhoods being very, very segregated. If you think over about East Fort Worth, over by Lancaster, Edgewood Terrace, the street I used to live on, that neighborhood in that area is very predominantly African American and Hispanic, right? That is still left over from when they had separated different ethnic groups, okay? And we still see it today, okay? So Judicial tests of equal protection. We have the reasonable basis test, meaning that inequalities are allowed when they are reasonably related to a legitimate government interest. And we have the strict scrutiny test. So it presumes the law is unconstitutional unless the government can provide a compelling basis for it. Under this law, we have something known as suspect classification. So race and natural origin are almost always considered discriminatory under this test. If they see anything relating to race under a different policy or requirement or what have you, they will automatically take it out. So, for example, in the 1950s, we had, and before, we had something known as a white primary, which we'll talk about on here too. So the white primary basically stated that only whites could vote in the election in the South. That right there would automatically be dinged under the strict scrutiny test, which is why it got taken out pretty quickly in the 1940s. Like poll tests, literacy tests, they affected both populations. They affected African Americans and they affected poor whites. So it was a lot harder to take those things out. It took a lot longer. But things that strictly refer to race, such as the grandfather clause, such as white primaries, those were automatically taken out. So gender classifications have kind of been placed in an intermediate category. So things like if it's substantially related to an important government objective, so such as the military exclusion of women in combat, it is thought that women cannot handle combat emotionally, stress-wise, all those different things. So because of that, it is seen as protecting a military objective. So that falls under that substantially related to the government objective category. So in recent years, the government, though, has struck down nearly every gender-based law it has reviewed except for the military combat situation. So this is just a chart for you to review, for you to use while you're taking your quizzes, your tests, that lists these different tests out for you and their application, okay? So 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So all persons are entitled to equal access to public accommodations, meaning that medium-sized and large firms cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, national origin in the hiring, promotion, and wages of employees. We really see this also being practiced through the Texas Equal Rights Amendment. So way back in the 1920s, women wanted to pass something known as the Equal Rights Amendment. All it did, it didn't cover any of this race, color, religion, national origin, none of that. All it did was cover this sex part, okay, male or female, right? Stating that they needed to be protected because of discrimination in jobs, trying to get benefits for jobs, wages, trying to find childcare, all these different things that affected women, right? So the amendment did not end up passing nationally. It did not have enough states supporting the amendment for it to go through. But Texas was actually one of the states that had approved this amendment. So because of that, we have something known as the Texas Equal Rights Amendment. So this is where you see whenever you're applying for jobs, what have you, the little part that says your employer cannot discriminate based on color, religion, race, sex, national origin, sexual orientation, that stuff. That is protected under the Texas Equal Rights Amendment. So Some forms of discrimination are still lawful. Okay, so usually things like religion are covered under their own umbrella. So, for example, church related schools can take religion into account in hiring teachers. This is because church related schools are private, not public, meaning they're not gaining funds from Texas or the federal government. So, because of that, only schools that are receiving those funds have to honor that separation of church and state because they are seen as an extension of the government. Schools that are not receiving those funds do not have to honor that separation. Okay, which is why they can take religion into account when they are hiring their teachers. So before 1965, we had the 15th Amendment in 1870 that granted African Americans the vote. Okay, down in the South. Remember, this is in Reconstruction era where there's a lot of work going on to be able to help the African American population to get an equal footing in the South. As soon as the North left the South during Reconstruction, as soon as they left, that's when we saw the establishment of Jim Crow, and that's whenever we saw African Americans seeing a dive in their equal rights. But under this amendment in 1870, it was supposed to give African American males the right to vote. Okay, so they were disenfranchised. Disenfranchised is just a fancy way of saying they got their suffrage taken away, they got their voting taken away by whites only primaries. Okay, so basically what they did was they had a primary in the state of Texas. Okay, there was one for the Republican, one for the Democrats. But in Texas, at that time, we were a one-party state, meaning that our state was supported by really only one party, and that was the Democrat Party. Okay, so what they did was they said if you are not white, you cannot vote in this primary, essentially completely cutting them out of the politics of the state, right? Because if you can't vote in the primary of the one party that is ruling your state, that means you're not getting any political voice, right? So they also saw challenges in literacy tests and poll taxes. These literacy tests were really ridiculous, guys. I kid you not, they would put these tests in French and Japanese, what have you, to keep the African American population from being able to read them, right? So if they saw that an African American individual could, in fact, read, that they had that they were literate, then they would change the language on them. True story. And then these poll taxes. Okay, so these poll taxes, they ended up being around, in today's money, around $45, which, depending on how much you're making, does not sound like a lot of money to poor broke college students, though, right? $45 can be a lot of money, especially if you're a parent, right? I remember whenever I was in college, that's whenever I had my children while I was in college, and formula was expensive, very expensive. So all of those expenses, diapers, formula, clothing for because kids grow really fast, clothing, all that stuff, right? Built up pretty fast. So having to pay $45 on top of all of that when you're barely making it as a college student, or if you're working, say, at a lower paid job, that's a lot of money, right? So that would also keep portions of the population from being able to vote. Now, these literacy tests and these poll taxes actually also did affect some of the white population. It tended to be the farmers of the state, those who were out in the middle of nowhere. They really had no access to education. Therefore, they were not really able to pass the literacy test and or pay the poll taxes, because our farmers throughout time have tended to be very low income. They're usually very poor. So because of the fact that the whites only primary was very outwardly based on race, the Supreme Court was able to take it out in the mid-1940s. These other ones, the literacy test, the poll taxes, the ones that aren't so obvious, did not get taken out till the 1960s. So the 24th Amendment, 1964, outlawed the poll tax. And 2 years later, 1966, the Supreme Court banned literacy tests. So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it prohibited discrimination in voting and in registration. And it also empowered federal agents to oversee voter registration. So they actually sent, the national government actually sent people to states like the state of Texas and Alabama and Arkansas, where we saw an issue with voter restrictions based on race. They actually sent people to these states to get our African American population registered to vote. So states were prevented from creating election districts that deliberately diluted the minority vote. This is also known as gerrymandering, right? Deliberately drawing the lines to make it so that way, I think we've covered this a little bit, to make it so that way different populations are canceled out by majority votes. So this was weakened significantly by the 2013 Supreme Court decision, Shelby County v. Holder, which invalidated portions of the law, basically saying that redistricting based on race is no longer an issue. So because of that, of course we could argue the validity of that, right? But because of that, they no longer needed to review our districts. Of course, now we're seeing more sneaky gerrymandering, where they are, instead of taking out and diluting minority votes, now they are doing it so that way different parties are favored. So we've seen the Republicans draw the redistricting lines in Texas, where the Republican Party is favored over the Democratic Party, to try and dilute the Democratic Party votes. And it, of course, has been sent to the Supreme Court now for review. So even though it has been taken out in this 2013 court decision, remember that our census in 2020 is the first census that happened after this decision. So because of that, we are still seeing the Supreme Court having to step in. Okay, so 1968, Congress passed legislation addressing discrimination in housing, known as redlining. Basically, this is the refusal of mortgages for homes in certain neighborhoods, primarily those with large African American populations. So things that we still see today, we still see where our African American populations and our Hispanic populations are denied loans based on the fact that the neighborhood is primarily white, and vice versa. This is still an issue, okay, that they're still trying to work out, figure out, and change. So strong patterns of housing segregation because of that are still very apparent. And also, even with these higher income neighborhoods, African Americans and Hispanics still have more difficulty in obtaining mortgages than whites with comparable income levels. Basically saying that even though these African American and Hispanic families are making the same amount of money as the whites who have mortgages in these neighborhoods, they are having a more difficult time trying to get this mortgage. They're being denied it because of the fact that they are African American or Hispanic. So affirmative action is the deliberate effort to provide full and equal opportunities in employment, education, and other areas for traditionally disadvantaged groups, because our African American, our Hispanic population, because of everything that they have been through historically, are still having a hard time. So for organizations receiving federal funding or contracts, okay, so anybody who's receiving federal funding or federal contracts has to follow this affirmative action law, okay, meaning that a certain percentage of their acceptance rate, especially for universities, has to be for minority groups. And for these different law cases, I will put them onto Canvas for your review. Okay, so de jure discrimination is discrimination based on law, and de facto discrimination is a condition whereby historically disadvantaged groups have fewer opportunities and benefits because of prejudice and economic circumstance. So it's established through the new concept of equality of result, meaning that the affirmative action is pretty much used to alleviate this de facto discrimination. So meaning that affirmative action is trying to take these groups that have been disadvantaged because of what has happened in our history, and they are trying to help them to have more opportunities. So the impetus behind the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the African American Civil Rights Movement, meaning that the push behind it was the Civil Rights Movement. This was led by Mr. Martin Luther King Jr. We saw this in things like the bus boycott. We saw this in things like the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where they actually marched to Washington, D.C. That's where Mr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech. So resistance to the Civil Rights Act was widespread, but now it's overt, meaning obvious discrimination has gradually ceased, but now it's more subtle. So it's harder to prove in court. So as you can see here, our populations tend to vote a certain way. Okay? Our white Americans tend to vote Republican. Okay, we are back. Okay. So, there we go. Okay, so 23% of our Asian Americans tend to vote Republican, and 9% of our African Americans tend to vote Republican. So, our white Americans over here, the reason why the number is lower is because the younger white population tends to vote Democrat. Okay, so this 55% that you are seeing with white Americans is the older generations. Hispanic Americans, this 30%, this is because our Hispanic American community is very heavily Catholic, and the Catholic community tends to side with the Republican Party because of the Republican Party's support for different religious issues. Okay, so Asian Americans, this 23%, our Asian Americans also tend to be our higher income, meaning that they are our business owners and that sort of thing, which is why this 23% vote Republican. Okay. So the struggle for equality, King's dream of an equal society for African Americans remains elusive. There's still a high disparity in income, meaning that there's still very much a gap between our white community and how much they make, and our minority community and how much they make. Our African American children are particularly disadvantaged because, again, a lot of our African American families live in poor neighborhoods. These poor neighborhoods tend to not have as good of schools, and so this affects our future generations because they are not having as many educational opportunities. So there has been substantial progress, though, in elective offices. I mean, we have seen a lot of African American voice within our government. We have seen 400 African American mayors, including cities like Dallas and Houston. We have seen 40 African American members of Congress, and our 44th president of the United States, Mr. Barack Obama, was also African American. So, woman. So the first large and well-organized promotion of women's rights, 1848, Seneca Falls, New York. So one of the things that happened here, guys, is women were really upset because they had helped the men, all men, be able to get the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. But once these men had the right to vote, these women were kind of pushed to the side. What the agreement was that once they helped these men get the right to vote, these men were then going to fight for the woman to get the right to vote. But that did not happen. Okay? So women were very upset about this. It wasn't until the 19th Amendment that the right to vote was extended to women. Okay? So the Equal Rights Amendment, this is what I talked about a little bit earlier, was introduced in 1923. It wasn't even reviewed by Congress until 1973. 50 years later, guys. It was not even reviewed. And all it said was that women would not be discriminated against just because of the fact that they were a woman. Okay? Didn't have anything to do with religion, ethnicity, anything like that. Just the fact that they were a woman. Okay? So other legislation is this Equal Pay Act, Title IX, Equal Credit Act, which I will provide resources for on Canvas for your review. Okay? So women have not achieved job equality. Women still earn less than men. The average pay is about 82% of that for male employees, meaning that for every dollar a man makes, women are only earning 82 cents. Okay? So women's groups continue to press for comparable worth policies that give women and men equal hourly pay for jobs that require similar training and education. Also meaning that women that have equal experience, equal qualifications, education, what have you, receive equal pay. Okay? Also, a lot of our single parent families are headed by women. And 1 in 3, that means 33 to 34%, live below the poverty line. And this is known as the feminization of poverty. So, what is troubling about this, guys, is that our inflation continues to grow, right? Even in going grocery shopping, I've noticed the prices of different products going up by as much as $2, right? Whenever you are already struggling as a single parent household because rent is very high, utilities have gotten a lot more expensive, groceries have gotten a lot more expensive, all of these different things. Because of that, it is making this poverty line and those who are living below it grow. Okay, we are seeing this not only with families headed by women, but a lot of different families struggling. So, percentage of family living in poverty by family composition. So the female-headed family, around 28%. and two-parent family around 5%. This is because two incomes make it a lot more easier to overcome that inflation barrier, right? Whereas a female-headed family having only one income makes it a lot harder. So women have made substantial gains, okay, in elective offices. We even have a woman being reviewed for Supreme Court. And she would be the first African American woman on our Supreme Court. So the first woman to serve on the Supreme Court was Sandra Day O'Connor, and she was appointed in 1981. The first woman on the national ticket of a major political party, meaning that she was on the primary ticket, Geraldine Ferraro as the Democratic Party's vice presidential nominee. First woman to head a major party's national ticket, Hillary Clinton, 2016. Kamala Harris elected as vice president in 2020. And women still hold less than 1 in 4 congressional seats. So this means that women are being underrepresented in our Congress. Okay? Because our Congress is supposed to represent every individual within our nation, correct? But the composition of our population is almost 50-50 with men and women, okay? But only 25%, less than 25% of women are being represented in our Congress, okay? So this is still held a substantial obstacle within lawmaking and voices being heard and that sort of thing. So as you can see, women's representation in different national legislatures, places like Sweden and Spain, it's almost at that 50-50, but the United States is still at 24%, and Japan is even lower at 10%, okay? So Hispanic Americans. So Hispanic Americans are one of the oldest ethnic groups in the nation. They were here before anybody came here. So the Spanish colonized Florida, New Mexico, California, and Arizona. A lot of them tended to marry within the Native American communities there. Which is why the ancestry of our Hispanic Americans tends to be Latin American and Native American and Spanish. So Hispanics are the fastest growing minority group in the U.S. It's about, I believe, around 2030, 2040, somewhere around there, that the Hispanic community is predicted to become the majority group in the U.S. The recent rights movement has centered on undocumented immigrants. So immigrants' income tends to be substantially lower than the average. Part of this is because of the fact that we have heightened immigration restrictions, especially after 2016. And because of this, it's a lot harder for them to be able to argue for their rights, because in doing so, a lot of them are afraid that they're going to be targeted for deportation. Okay, so because of this, it's a lot more difficult for them to be able to argue for those better working conditions, those better wages, all that sort of things. So more than 4,000 Hispanic Americans hold public office. So our Hispanic American community, pretty much out of everybody, is actually doing better in terms of political office. A lot of our political offices in Texas, especially those in Texas, are held by Hispanic Americans. So more than 4,000 Hispanic Americans hold public office. They hold Congress, Supreme Court, and places in the executive branch, such as in the bureaucracy, the cabinet, which we've talked about. About half of all Hispanic Americans are registered to vote. And they are definitely a political force in states like Texas, California, and Florida, where they tend to be a higher percentage of the population. So our Native American, the population decreased from 5 to 10 million. The actual number of Native Americans is unknown. So these are kind of a conjecture of how many were within the North American continent before the Europeans came to settle here. So they were less than 1 million by 1900. A lot of that had to do with a lot of the settlers having wars with the Native Americans, and the settlers had the advantage because they had guns and cannons and those sorts of things, while the Native Americans had bows and arrows. And a lot of it also had to do with the fact that the settlers brought over a lot of diseases that the Native Americans did not have immunities to, like smallpox, and that killed a lot of them. So they were not granted citizenship until 1924. That means that within the birth of our nation, for 140, at least 140 years, our Native Americans were not considered American citizens. Okay, so that should tell you how much our government has discluded our Native American community. Okay, so the Indian Bill of Rights passed in 1968. It provided for constitutional guarantees for Native Americans on reservations. We still do see a lot of argument between the government and Native American communities whenever it comes to the reservations and the government trying to take over land. Okay, so full-blooded Native Americans, meaning 100% Native American, including Alaskan natives, number more than 2 million, meaning our communities have grown again. Half live on or near federal reservations. Federal authority is defined by treaty terms because they are technically their own nations within these reservations. And these state governments have no direct authority over these reservations. So the current policy goals of the federal government include retention of native cultures. So reason being is because whenever we saw a loss of our Native Americans, we saw a complete loss of cultures, tribes, all of those different things, languages, all those different things. So our government has set a goal of trying to retain those native cultures so that no longer happens. And also through self-government, meaning to be able to make their own laws, and economic self-sufficiency, which is why you see the casinos over in places like Oklahoma. They are a very high source of income for these tribes that they need, which is why there has been such a conflict between the tribes and the states, especially states that don't normally allow casinos within their state boundaries. So as you can see, our minority population, a lot of them are in the South, and this has to do with our settling of Asian Americans in California through things like the gold rush and building the transcontinental railroad in the 1800s. And then also our Hispanic Americans, a lot of them migrated from Mexico, which is very close to our southern states, right? Which is why a lot of the immigrant population is within the South. Not only that, Florida is next to Cuba, and we see a lot of Cuban Americans, Cubans coming to America, becoming Cuban Americans, and a lot of them settle in Florida. Okay, so Asian Americans, Chinese, and Japanese laborers were brought to the western states as laborers in mines and railroads in the late 1800s. This was around that gold rush time. 1892, this is whenever we saw the Chinese Exclusion Act basically making it illegal for people from China to come to the United States, and this was in place until 1965. We also saw within our Asian American community a major court case known as Lau v. Nichols prompted the beginning of bilingual instruction in some schools. Basically, the argument of this case was that schools weren't providing bilingual education. So because of that, merely because our students were not understanding what was going on because they did not know as much English as the other children in the schools, they were falling behind. So this is what set the groundwork for our Asian American community, our Hispanic American community, to be able to have that bilingual instruction in our schools. So Asian Americans now number around 12 million. Most live on the West Coast, particularly in California. This is where the Chinese migrated to during the gold rush. And there was also railroad job opportunities, okay, through that transcontinental railroad. So Asian Americans are an upwardly mobile group, meaning that socially they are climbing the ladder. Most Asian cultures emphasize family-based self-reliance, an emphasis on education, which can also give you a leg up, right? So with a college education, your job opportunities open up. Highest percentage of two-parent families of any racial group, mean that our Asian Americans have the highest percentage of two-parent families and the highest median family income. So over here, through the changing face of immigration, you can see that in 1950, a lot of our immigrants came from places like Europe and Canada. Okay, over here in 1980, that's whenever we started to see a switch, where we have a lot more immigration from places like Asia and Latin America. Okay. So, other disadvantaged groups. So, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 classified only women and minorities as legally protected groups. Other disadvantaged groups have gained protection through other legislation. We have seen a lot of progress for our older Americans. So, basically, in a nutshell, these two acts have made it so that way employers cannot base promotion or employment opportunities on age. Okay, they tend to concentrate on salary now. So people who are making a higher salary tend to get targeted, which also tend to be the older ones because they were the ones with more experience in the company. But it cannot be directly tied to age. Okay, and then Americans with disabilities, basically over here in this education for all handicapped children, children cannot be denied an education, which is why you see special education services within our schools. And Americans with disabilities, we as a nation cannot discriminate on the fact that someone has a disability in an employment decision and or continued employment decision. Okay. So our LGBTQ community, they were formally barred from military service. They had no employment protections or rights in a lot of states. Texas, remember, was not one of those. They had them under the Equal Rights Amendment. Such prohibitions no longer exist. Okay, so you cannot be denied employment opportunities or military employment opportunities based on the fact that you are attracted to the same sex. Okay, so the U.S. has seen a rapid swing in public opinion towards acceptance of same-sex marriage in the last 2 decades. We saw 2004, Massachusetts was the first state that permitted same-sex marriage, 2004. And then in 2015, we saw the Supreme Court basically make it a national decision that a state cannot deny you marriage based on the fact that your partner is the same sex. Okay, so as you can see, the opinions on same-sex marriage have definitely changed between 1997, where it was only around 30% of acceptance of it, to 2019, where it was almost 80%. Okay, and I would bet you that if they had 2020 on there, 2021, it would probably still show an upward trend. Okay, so last slide. America's high ideals towards civil rights have clashed with its reality. We've made a lot of progress. We still have a long way to go. It is still necessary to combat America's curse of discrimination. As Abraham Lincoln said, the United States is a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So basically, the United States is dedicated to this agreement, this aspiration that all men are created